In the silent lawyer's office, when he said my father had left everything to her, I felt my heart tear open, but he hadn't yet seen what I carried in my briefcase. I never imagined I'd step into an office like that. Enormous windows, mirrored glass, walls so white they almost blinded you. Everything smelled of cleanliness, as if no pain could enter there. But I entered, and I brought with me 26 years of unresolved questions. My name is Jiwoo. I was born in Daegu, and my father's absence was the first ghost I learned to live with. I grew up hearing my uncle say that some men simply leave, but I always thought my father had left specifically from me. Each winter seemed to carry his trace in the streets, in the cold wind that swept the sidewalks, in the absence of a hug I never had. Before I continue, I want to ask you something. If you understand this kind of pain, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I want more people to know they're not alone. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who ever felt like they weren't enough for someone who should have loved them unconditionally. My mother sewed until dawn, the weak light from the lamp illuminating her tired silhouette. She said I had to study, grow, be bigger than the pain. I tried, but some nights, the distant sound of trains made my chest tighten, as if life was always leaving me, just like he did. The apartment where I grew up smelled of fabric and instant noodles. The walls were thin enough that I could hear our neighbor's television, the couple arguing upstairs, the world continuing while ours seemed frozen and waiting. My mother never spoke badly of him. She'd simply say, "Your father had his reasons," and then return to her sewing machine, her foot pressing the pedal in a rhythm that sounded like resignation. I remember being 7 years old, sitting by the window during my birthday, watching every car that passed, wondering if maybe, just maybe, this would be the year he'd remember. The cake my mother made, small, with strawberries she'd saved money for weeks to buy, sat on our table until the candles melted into the frosting. She sang Happy Birthday alone, her voice cracking on my name. I blew out the candles anyway, making the same wish I'd made every year, that he'd come back and explain why I wasn't enough. But that explanation never came, or rather, it didn't come in the way I expected. Years passed like pages in a book I never wanted to read. I studied hard, partly because my mother wanted me to, partly because achievement felt like the only proof I had worth. If I couldn't be loved, at least I could be excellent. At least I could be something other than the girl whose father disappeared into the fog of broken promises. I graduated top of my class. My mother cried at the ceremony, her hands trembling as she held the cheap camera she'd borrowed from our neighbor. I scanned the crowd anyway, even knowing he wouldn't be there. Hope is a stubborn thing. It survives even when logic tells it to die. But nothing prepared me for the phone call that came on a Tuesday morning in March. The voice on the other end was professional, detached. "Miss Park Jiwoo, I'm calling regarding your father, Park Junho. I'm sorry to inform you that he passed away last week." The words hit me like stones thrown at glass. Not sharp enough to shatter, just hard enough to crack. I stood in my small apartment, the one I'd worked 3 jobs to afford, holding the phone against my ear, feeling absolutely nothing, and then feeling everything at once. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just exhaled. A breath I'd been holding since childhood. The lawyer continued talking. Something about a will, about my presence being requested in Seoul, about legal proceedings. I said yes without thinking. Yes, I'd come. Yes, I'd be there. Yes, yes, yes. As if agreeing could somehow rewrite the past. Mal sabia eu que aquela viagem mudaria não apenas meu futuro, mas minha compreensão completa do passado. The train ride to Seoul felt eternal. I watched the landscape blur past the window, rice fields turning into industrial zones, small towns dissolving into the massive sprawl of the city. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, and I barely recognized myself. When did I become this woman? When did the little girl waiting by the window transform into someone who could receive news of her father's ending with such emptiness? I checked into a modest hotel near Gangnam. The room was small but clean, with a view of an alley where delivery drivers rushed past on motorcycles, their thermal bags strapped to their backs. I sat on the edge of the bed, my suitcase still packed, and let myself feel the weight of what was happening. My father was gone. Truly, finally gone. And I was about to walk into a room and deal with the administrative aftermath of a relationship that never really existed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked to a convenience store at 2 a.m., bought a triangle kimbap and a can of coffee, and sat on a plastic chair outside, watching Seoul's insomnia play out before me. A woman in heels walked past, crying into her phone. A group of students stumbled by, laughing about something I couldn't hear. Life, continuing, always continuing, whether you were ready or not. The morning arrived too quickly and too slowly at the same time. I dressed carefully. A simple black dress, minimal makeup, my mother's pearl earrings. I wanted to look put together, even if I felt like I was falling apart. The law office was in a gleaming tower in Uedo, the kind of building that screamed money and power. The lobby had marble floors so polished I could see my reflection walking across them. The elevator was silent, except for the soft classical music playing overhead. Floor 42. The doors opened to reveal a reception area that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel. A young woman with perfect posture smiled at me professionally. "Miss Park, Mr. Kim is expecting you." She gestured toward a conference room at the end of a long hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. I still didn't know what I was walking into. I opened the door, and that's when I saw her. Minseo, the second wife. The woman whose name my mother only ever whispered, as if saying it too loud might make the pain more real. She was sitting at the far end of the conference table, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored suit, her hair pulled back in a flawless bun. She looked up when I entered, and for a moment, our eyes met. She didn't smile, didn't frown, just looked, as if I were a problem she'd been expecting but hoping would disappear. I sat down slowly, my hands trembling as I placed my briefcase on the table. The leather was worn, a hand-me-down from my uncle, but it was mine. It held my documents, my identification, and something else, something I wasn't sure I'd have the courage to reveal. The lawyer entered moments later, a middle-aged man with graying hair and the kind of face that had seen too many family disputes. "Good morning," he said, settling into his chair with practiced ease. "Thank you both for coming. I know this is a difficult time, so I'll try to be as efficient as possible." Efficient, as if grief could be scheduled between appointments. He opened a folder, adjusted his glasses, and began reading. The words washed over me like cold water. Properties in Gangnam, investments, savings accounts, the family business. Numbers that meant nothing to me but apparently meant everything in this room. I wasn't listening to the details. I was listening for my name. It never came. In accordance with the deceased's will, all assets and properties are hereby bequeathed to Mrs. Song Minseo, his wife of 18 years. The room tilted, not dramatically. I didn't faint, didn't gasp, but something inside me shifted, like furniture being rearranged in a dark room. All of it, everything, every single thing my father had built, earned, saved, invested, given to her. Not to the daughter he abandoned, not to the child who spent 26 years wondering why she wasn't enough. To the woman who came after. I should have expected it, but expecting pain doesn't make it hurt less. Minseo's expression didn't change. She simply nodded, as if this was the natural order of things, as if my erasure from my father's life was as ordinary as sunrise. The lawyer continued talking, something about transition of assets, legal procedures, timeline for transfer. His voice became white noise. I stared at the table, at the polished wood reflecting the fluorescent lights, and felt that old, familiar ache spread through my chest. The same ache I felt at 7, at 15, at 23. The ache of not mattering, of being easily forgotten, of being the rough draft of someone's life story, crumpled up and thrown away before the final version. But then I remembered what I carried in my briefcase, and that's when everything changed. My hands were steadier than I expected as I opened the worn leather. I pulled out the bundle carefully. Letters, dozens of them, tied with a faded ribbon. They smelled like old paper in my mother's closet, where they'd been hidden for 2 decades. I'd found them 6 months ago, tucked in a shoebox at the back of her wardrobe, when I was helping her move to a smaller apartment. I placed them on the table, one by one. The lawyer's voice faltered. Minseo's eyes widened, just slightly. The first crack in her porcelain composure. "Before you finalize anything," I said, my voice quieter than I wanted, but stronger than I felt, "I think you should read these." The lawyer hesitated, then picked up the first envelope. It was addressed to me, in handwriting I'd never seen but somehow recognized. He opened it carefully, read silently, then looked at me with something that might have been sympathy, or might have been professional concern. "These are letters from the deceased," he said slowly, "addressed to Miss Park Jiwoo, dated over a span of 15 years. He picked up another, then another. His expression shifted with each one he read. Minseo finally spoke. "Those could be fake." Her voice was sharp, defensive. I looked at her directly for the first time. "They're not. I said simply. My mother kept every single one. Every letter he sent that somehow never reached me. Every attempt he made that was blocked. The word hung in the air like smoke. Blocked. Not lost. Not forgotten. Blocked. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mrs. Song, I'll need to authenticate these, but if they're legitimate, they could indicate that the deceased He intended to give everything to me, Minseo interrupted. He made that will himself, freely, of sound mind. Whatever happened before doesn't matter. It matters to me, I said. The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. The lawyer gathered the letters carefully, his professional mask slipping just enough to show the human underneath. I'm going to need to suspend the execution of this will pending a full investigation. These letters suggest there may have been interference in the deceased's relationship with his legal heir. Legal heir. The words felt strange in my mouth, like speaking a foreign language. Minseo stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. You can't just... I can, actually, the lawyer said, his tone firm but not unkind. And I must, given the circumstances. Miss Park, I'll need you to provide the original letters and a statement about how they came into your mother's possession. Mrs. Song, you're welcome to retain legal counsel. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks. She left without looking at me. The door closed with a controlled click that somehow felt more violent than a slam. I sat there, surrounded by my father's words, feeling like I'd opened Pandora's box without knowing what would fly out. The lawyer gave me a card. Call me if you need anything, he said. And Miss Park, I'm sorry, for all of it. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I gathered the letters carefully, retying them with the ribbon my mother had used. My hands were shaking now, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving behind something that felt like grief mixed with fury, mixed with a strange, unexpected hope. But nothing prepared me for what came next. The investigation took 3 months. 3 months of lawyers calling, of documents being reviewed, of my mother giving testimony about the letters, about the phone calls that came when I was at school, about the money that showed up in our mailbox with no return address, about the man who appeared outside our apartment building twice, but never knocked on our door. I learned things I never wanted to know. I learned that my father tried to come back when I was 9, but was told I didn't want to see him. I learned that he sent money every month, money my mother received but never told me about, because she didn't want me to think his absence could be bought. I learned that he wrote to me on every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone he could remember. I learned that someone intercepted every letter. Minseo's lawyer fought hard. She claimed the letters were fabrications, that my mother was lying, that I was manipulating the situation for financial gain. She painted me as the opportunistic daughter who appeared only after death, smelling inheritance like a vulture circles prey. But the truth has a weight that lies can't carry. The letters were authenticated. The dates matched postal records. The handwriting was verified. And slowly, piece by piece, the story emerged. My father had been weak, yes. He'd made choices that hurt people, yes. He'd left my mother for Minseo, yes. But he'd never intended to leave me. He'd tried, in his limited, flawed way, to maintain some connection. And Minseo, afraid of losing her comfortable new life, had made sure those attempts failed. The judge's ruling came on a gray morning in June. Partial reversion of assets, recognition of paternal abandonment, acknowledgement of interference in parental rights, financial compensation, legal fees, cold administrative words for a wound that had bled for 26 years. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Because here's what nobody tells you about finally getting answers. They don't heal the years you spent without them. I stood outside the courthouse, watching rain begin to fall. People rushed past with umbrellas, businessmen checking their phones, students laughing despite the weather, the world continuing, always continuing. I thought about my father, the stranger whose blood I carried, whose absence shaped me, whose letters I'd never read when they could have mattered. I thought about my mother, who kept those letters hidden because she was trying to protect me from hope, that most dangerous emotion. I thought about the little girl I was, waiting by the window, making birthday wishes that never came true. I thought about Minseo, who was probably in her expensive apartment right now, hating me, blaming me, never once considering that she'd stolen something more valuable than money. She'd stolen the possibility of connection. But mostly, I thought about who I'd become in the absence of all that love. Strong, yes. Independent, yes. Successful by my own definition. But also closed, guarded, Someone who didn't trust easily, didn't hope freely, didn't believe that people stayed. And I realized something that made me cry for the first time since this all began. The rain mixed with my tears as I stood there on the courthouse steps. People walked around me like I was a stone in a river. I cried for my father, who was too weak to fight for me. I cried for my mother, who was too strong to show how much it all hurt her. I cried for myself, the child version who waited, and the adult version who stopped waiting. But I also cried because I was free from wondering, free from the ghost, free from the question that had haunted me since I was old enough to understand absence. Why wasn't I enough? Because now I knew. It was never about being enough. It was about broken people making broken choices, and those choices rippling out like stones thrown in water, reaching shores they never intended to touch. I walked slowly through the rain toward the subway station. My phone buzzed. My lawyer, probably, with more documents to sign, more procedures to complete. I ignored it. For the first time in months, I wanted to just be, to exist without purpose, without direction, without the weight of this inheritance hanging over me. I found myself walking to Yawidohan River Park. The rain had softened to a drizzle. The park was nearly empty, except for a few cyclists and an elderly couple sharing an umbrella. I walked along the path, watching the river flow past, gray and endless. Seoul's skyline stretched across the opposite bank, all glass and ambition and forward motion. I sat on a bench that was slightly damp, not caring about my clothes. The river smell, that mix of water and earth and city, filled my lungs. I thought about what I'd do with the money. Some of it would go to my mother, obviously. She'd protest, but I'd insist. She'd earned it with every dawn she spent at that sewing machine, every smile she forced when I came home from school asking why I didn't have a father like other kids. Some of it I'd save. Some I'd use to finally take that trip I'd always wanted. Maybe somewhere far, somewhere with no memories attached. Maybe I'd go back to Daegu and see if the apartment we lived in still stood, if the window where I used to wait still overlooked the same street. But mostly I realized the money didn't matter. Not really. What mattered was sitting right here in my chest, unfurling like a flower that had been clenched closed for decades. The understanding that I was never the problem. The abandonment I experienced wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of other people's limitations, fears, and failures. My father didn't leave because I wasn't enough. He left because he wasn't enough for himself. The sun began breaking through the clouds, sending shafts of light across the water. I watched the way the light danced, fractured and beautiful. A cyclist passed by, their wheels making a soft sound against the wet pavement. Somewhere in the distance, children were laughing. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photos I'd taken of some of the letters before handing them to the lawyers. I'd read them all, eventually. Each one was painful and precious. Glimpses of a father I never knew. Apologies that came decades too late. Love that existed, but couldn't find its way home. One letter, dated on my 16th birthday, said, "Jiwoo, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to know that everything I built was always meant for you. I just didn't know how to cross the bridge I burned. I hope someday you'll understand that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life, and everything since has been me trying to earn back what I threw away." I read those words again, sitting by the river, and felt something shift. Not forgiveness exactly, but release. He was human, flawed, weak, frightened. He made terrible choices and lived with their consequences, and so did I. But his choices didn't have to define my story anymore. I thought about Minseo too. I wondered what she was feeling right now. Anger, probably. Betrayal, certainly. She'd lost something she thought was securely hers, but I couldn't bring myself to hate her, even though part of me wanted to. She was scared too. Scared of being nothing, of having nothing, of losing the life she'd built on someone else's brokenness. Fear makes people do terrible things. I knew that better than anyone. Maybe one day I'd tell her that I understood, that I didn't need her regret or her apology, that we were both casualties of my father's inability to choose clearly, to love completely, to be brave when it mattered most. But not today. Today, I just needed to sit here and let the weight of 26 years slide off my shoulders and sink into the river, carried away by current and time. My phone buzzed again. This time I looked. It was my mother. "Jiwoo-ya, did everything go okay? Call me when you can." I made kimchi jjigae. I smiled. My mother, who'd survived everything with nothing but a sewing machine and stubbornness, was making kimchi jjigae. Life, continuing. Love, persisting in the smallest, most important ways. I called her. She answered on the first ring. "Iyama," I said, and my voice cracked. "Iyama, it's over." "I know, baby," she said softly. "Come home. Come eat." And I did. The weeks that followed were strange. The money was transferred. The properties were divided. The legal proceedings concluded. I found myself suddenly wealthy in a way that felt disconnected from reality. My small apartment felt even smaller. My job, teaching English at a language academy, felt like it belonged to a different version of me. But I didn't quit. I didn't move to a luxury apartment. I didn't buy expensive things I didn't need. Instead, I took a week off and went to Daegu with my mother. We stayed in a small hotel near our old neighborhood. The building where we lived had been demolished, replaced by a modern apartment complex. But the street was the same. The convenience store where my mother bought discounted rice cakes was still there, though under new management. We walked slowly through our past, her arm linked in mine. She was older now, her hair more gray than black, her steps less certain. But she was still strong, still here, still the one who stayed. "Do you hate him?" I asked her one evening as we sat in a pojangmatcha, eating tteokbokki and fish cakes. She was quiet for a long time, chewing slowly. Finally, she said, "I did, for a long time. But hatred is heavy, Jiwuya, and I was already carrying so much." She looked at me, her eyes wet but not crying. "I never told you this, but he did try. In the beginning, he'd call, send letters. I was so angry that I made it hard for him. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if he really loved you, he'd try harder. And when he didn't," she shook her head, "I realized too late that some people don't know how to fight for what they love. They just know how to run." That night, I understood my mother in a new way. She wasn't perfect. She'd made choices too, choices born from pain and pride. She'd kept those letters hidden, thinking she was sparing me, but in hiding them, she'd also hidden the possibility of understanding. We'd both lived in the shadow of my father's absence, and we'd both shaped ourselves around that shadow in ways we never examined. I wasn't angry at her. I was grateful, because despite everything, she'd loved me enough to stay. She'd loved me enough to work until her hands ached. She'd loved me enough to sacrifice every comfort so I could have chances she never had. Her love wasn't perfect, but it was present. And presence, I was learning, mattered more than perfection. When we returned to Seoul, I did something I'd been avoiding. I asked the lawyer for my father's address, the place where he'd lived with Min Seo. It was an apartment in Gangnam, expensive and modern. I stood outside the building for 20 minutes before I had the courage to go in. The doorman asked if I had an appointment. I said no. He was about to turn me away when I said, "I'm Park Junho's daughter." Something in his expression shifted. "Ah," he said quietly. "Please, come in." The elevator ride felt like ascending into a memory I never had. The apartment was on the 15th floor. I stood outside the door for a long time, my hand raised to knock, my heart hammering. What was I doing here? What did I expect to find? But I knocked anyway, before I could talk myself out of it. Min Seo opened the door. She looked different, smaller, somehow, tired. She didn't seem surprised to see me. "I wondered when you'd come," she said. She stepped aside. "Do you want tea?" The apartment was beautiful, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, minimalist furniture, expensive art on the walls. It looked like a showroom, not a home. We sat in the living room, tea growing cold between us on a glass coffee table. "I didn't know about the letters," she said finally. "Not all of them. I knew he tried to contact you in the beginning, and I discouraged it. I told him you didn't want to see him, that your mother had poisoned you against him. I believed it would be easier for everyone if he just moved forward. With me. With our life." She looked into her teacup. "I was selfish and scared. I thought if he went back to being your father, he'd realize he made a mistake choosing me. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to yell, to tell her exactly how many years she'd stolen, how many birthdays and graduations and ordinary moments she'd erased. But sitting there, seeing her in her beautiful, empty apartment, I realized she'd lost things too. She'd lost the man she thought she knew. She'd lost the security she'd tried so hard to build. She'd lost whatever peace she might have had, knowing she'd kept a father from his child. "I don't forgive you," I said quietly. "I don't know if I ever will, but I don't hate you either. I just need you to know that I existed, that I mattered, that I was his daughter before I was your obstacle." She nodded, tears streaming down her face silently. "I know," she whispered. "I know." I left shortly after. Walking back through those gleaming hallways, riding down the polished elevator, stepping back onto the street where life continued in its noisy and different way. I felt something I hadn't felt since this all began. Lightness. I had faced her. I had said what I needed to say, and now I could walk away. The months turned into a year. I used some of the inheritance to help my mother retire. She protested, of course, but eventually accepted. She took up watercolor painting, something she'd always wanted to try. Her small apartment filled with paintings of flowers and mountains and abstract swirls of color. I took that trip I'd dreamed about, 3 months backpacking through Southeast Asia. I saw temples and beaches and street markets. I ate food I couldn't pronounce. I made friends who didn't know my story, who met me as just Jiwoo, not the abandoned daughter, not the inheritance fight winner, just me. In Thailand, I met a man named Taehyun. He was Korean, traveling alone like me, taking a break from his job as an architect in Busan. We met at a hostel in Chiang Mai, both of us terrible at haggling with tuk-tuk drivers. We started traveling together, first for a week, then 2, then the rest of my trip. He asked about my family one night as we sat on a beach in Vietnam, watching the stars. I told him the simplified version. Father absent, recently passed away, complicated. He nodded and said, "My father was there, but absent. Sometimes I think that's worse, having them right in front of you but never really being seen." For the first time, I felt understood by someone who hadn't lived my exact pain, but recognized its shape. We didn't make promises. When my trip ended, we exchanged numbers and said we'd see what happened. But something had shifted in me during those months away. I'd learned that I could be happy, that I could laugh without guilt, that I could meet someone new and not immediately sabotage it with my defenses and my wounds. Back in Seoul, I made changes. I left the language academy and started working for an NGO that helped children from broken families. The pay was less, but the meaning was more. I worked with kids who had similar stories to mine. Absent parents, complicated grief, questions nobody could answer. I told them what I wished someone had told me. You are not the absence you experienced. You are not what was taken from you. You are what you chose to become despite everything. Some of them believed me. Some were too hurt to believe anything yet. I understood both. Taehyun and I kept in touch. Texts became calls. Calls became visits. Visits became a relationship that felt different from anything I'd known. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't about filling a void. It was just 2 people choosing each other, clearly and consistently. One evening, about 18 months after everything concluded, I took him to Uidohan River Park. We sat on a bench, maybe the same one where I'd sat that day after the trial, though I couldn't be sure. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "This is where I came when it all ended," I told him, when I finally understood. "Understood what?" he asked, his hand finding mine. That the story I'd been telling myself my whole life was wrong. I'd believed I was unlovable, that there was something deficient in me that made my father leave. I'd believed that love was conditional, that it could be withdrawn at any moment, that I had to earn it through perfection. I'd believed that the wound I carried would define me forever. But sitting there by the river again, with Taehyun beside me and the city lights beginning to glow across the water, I realized I had inherited something from my father after all. Not money, not property, but the lesson of what not to do. The lesson of what love looks like when it's brave enough to stay. The lesson that some inheritances are worth refusing. My father left me everything, I said to Taehyun, when he left me nothing. He showed me exactly who I didn't want to become. And in fighting for what he should have given me, I found out who I actually am. Taehyun squeezed my hand. "And who's that?" I smiled, watching a cyclist pass by, their wheels turning steadily forward. Someone who stays, someone who fights, someone who's enough, exactly as she is. The thing about healing is that it doesn't happen all at once. There were still hard days. Days when I'd see a father with his daughter and feel that old ache. Days when I'd wonder what life would have been like if he'd been brave enough to cross the bridge back to me. Days when I'd be angry all over again at Minseo, at my mother, at him, at the whole complicated web of choices that shaped my childhood. But those days became fewer, and between them were longer stretches of peace, of joy, of building a life that wasn't defined by what I'd lost, but by what I'd chosen. I heard through my lawyer that Minseo had moved. Smaller apartment, different neighborhood. I didn't reach out. Maybe someday I would. Maybe someday enough time would pass that we could sit together and acknowledge the damage without blame. But not yet. My mother and Taehyun met, of course. She loved him immediately. In that way mothers do when they see someone treating their daughter with care. She made him kimchi jjigae, just like she'd made for me the night everything ended. We sat around her small table, eating and talking, and I felt surrounded by the kind of inheritance that actually mattered. Love that shows up, love that stays, love that doesn't make you earn it. On the 2nd anniversary of my father's passing, I went to his grave. I'd never been before. It was in a cemetery in the hills outside Seoul, quiet and green. His stone was simple. Park Junho. Dates. Nothing else. I stood there for a long time, trying to feel something profound, but I just felt neutral. He was a stranger who happened to share my blood. His choices had shaped me, yes, but they didn't own me anymore. I hope you're at peace, I said quietly. I hope wherever you are, you're braver than you were here, and I hope you know that I turned out okay. Not because of you, but despite you. And maybe that's enough. I left a single flower, not from grief, but from closure. That night, I had dinner with my mother and Taehyun at a restaurant overlooking the city. We talked about ordinary things, a movie she'd seen, a project he was working on, my plans to take some kids from the NGO on a camping trip. Normal life, beautiful, ordinary, normal life. As we were leaving, my mother pulled me aside. "Are you happy?" she asked, searching my face. I thought about the question, really thought about it. A year ago, I wouldn't have known how to answer. Happiness felt like something other people had, something I'd missed the delivery of. But standing there, with the city lights glittering below us and Taehyun waiting patiently by the car, I realized, yes, Yama, I am. She smiled, tears in her eyes, and kissed my forehead like she used to when I was small. "Good," she whispered. "That's all I ever wanted." We walked to the car together, 3 people who'd survived different storms but found each other in the aftermath. Life didn't become perfect. That's not how healing works. But it became mine, fully, completely mine. Not defined by absence or inheritance or the ghosts of someone else's choices. Mine. I stopped teaching the kids at the NGO that they needed to forgive. Forgiveness is complicated, personal, sometimes impossible. Instead, I taught them they needed to release. Release the story that they weren't enough. Release the belief that someone else's failure was their fault. Release the weight of carrying someone else's broken pieces. You can't inherit someone else's damage, I told them. You can only inherit what you choose to carry forward. Some days I carried forward my father's lesson of what love shouldn't look like. Some days I carried forward my mother's lesson of resilience. Some days I carried forward the lesson I'd learned myself, that the strongest thing you can do is choose your own story. And every day, I carried forward this truth. I was enough. I had always been enough. The little girl who waited by the window didn't wait anymore. She'd grown into a woman who opened her own doors, who built her own home, who created her own family from the people who chose to stay, who understood that the deepest inheritance isn't what someone leaves you when they die. It's what you learn to give yourself when you're finally ready to live. Years later, when people asked about my father, I'd smile and say, "He taught me everything I needed to know about how not to love." And sometimes that's the most valuable lesson of all. Because here's what I learned in that lawyer's office, in that courthouse, by that river, and in all the quiet moments between. You don't need someone else's approval to know your worth. You don't need an inheritance to know you're valuable. You don't need closure to move forward. You just need to decide, one morning, that you're tired of carrying someone else's baggage. And then, step by step, you put it down. I put it down. And I walked away lighter. Not perfect, not without scars, but free. Free to be loved without conditions. Free to build a life that reflected my choices, not my wounds. Free to be Jiwoo, not the abandoned daughter, not the inheritance fight survivor, but just Jiwoo, whole, enough, here. And if you're reading this, if you recognize this pain, I want you to know, you're enough too. You don't need the approval of people who couldn't see your value. You don't need to earn love from people who were too broken to give it. You don't need to wait by any window for anyone to remember you exist. You exist. Brilliantly, completely, worthily. And the day you realize that, really realize it, in your bones and your breath, is the day you inherit the only thing that ever mattered, yourself. If this story touched something in you, leave a heart in the comments and share it with someone who needs to hear this. And remember, you are enough, exactly as you are. You always have been. You always will be. The city lights blurred through my tears as I stood on my apartment balcony that night, watching Seoul breathe beneath me. Somewhere in those millions of lights were other people learning the same lesson, other people putting down baggage that was never theirs to carry, other people choosing themselves for the first time. I raised my teacup to them, to me, to everyone who ever felt like they weren't enough. To inheritance, I whispered, not of money or property or pain, but of the strength to choose who we become. The night air was cool, the city hummed its endless song, and I stood there, whole at last, inheriting the only thing I ever needed, my own fierce, beautiful, unbreakable self, the end of waiting, the beginning of living, the inheritance of truth.